And sometimes life quietly guides us to places we never expected to go. Not because we planned every step, but because something in our heart keeps pulling us closer. Closer to a feeling, closer to a person, closer to a place that suddenly begins to feel like home. Today, I want to share something honest with you. Something simple, but very real. A decision I made that might seem ordinary on the surface. Yet it carries a story behind it. A story about presence, about distance, and about the quiet reasons that live inside the human heart. You see, recently I bought a home near your city, and people keep asking me why. Why that place? Why there? Why now? The truth is, there is a reason that isn't written on any contract or map, a reason that doesn't appear in real estate listings. And tonight I want to tell you that reason. I bought this home near your city for a reason. When I say that sentence, it sounds simple, almost ordinary. People hear it and imagine practical things. Maybe they think about work, about opportunities, about a better neighborhood, or about convenience. They imagine contracts, bank papers, moving boxes, and keys being handed over across a desk. They imagine a transaction. But the truth is that sometimes the biggest decisions in life are not made by logic or strategy. Sometimes they are made quietly, almost invisibly, by the heart. There are moments in life when something changes without making a loud announcement. No fireworks, no dramatic music, just a quiet realization that something inside you has shifted. You wake up one morning and the map of your world feels different. Places that once felt far away suddenly feel closer. Places that once meant nothing suddenly carry meaning. Your city became one of those places for me. I remember the first time I noticed how often your city appeared in my thoughts. At first, it was nothing serious, just a passing idea, like a cloud drifting across the sky. But the strange thing about thoughts like that is that they rarely stay small. They return again and again. Quietly, you hear the name of the city in a conversation and your attention sharpens. You see it written somewhere, and your eyes stop for a moment longer than they should. You catch yourself imagining the streets, the parks, the small cafes, the evening lights, the ordinary life unfolding there. And without fully realizing it, you begin to care about a place you have never really lived in. People like to believe that we always know exactly why we make our decisions. They like to think that life is built on careful plans. But sometimes the truth is more human than that. Time to music. Sometimes we move because a feeling slowly grows inside us until ignoring it becomes impossible. For me, that feeling was connected to you. Not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way. This is just in the quiet, persistent way that certain people begin to occupy a corner of your mind. The kind of presence that doesn't demand attention, but somehow always receives it. I would go through my day like anyone else. Work, responsibilities, conversations, the small routines that fill our hours. But somewhere between those moments, you would appear in my thoughts. Sometimes because of something you said, but sometimes because of something you wrote, sometimes for no reason at all. And each time it happened, the distance between our cities felt a little more noticeable. Distance is an interesting thing. On a map, it looks clear and measurable. A certain number of kilometers, a certain number of hours on the road, but the emotional weight of distance is harder to calculate. It depends entirely on who lives at the other end of it. 1,000 kilometers can feel insignificant when the person at the other end means something to you, and 10 kilometers can feel impossible when the connection between two people is fragile or fading. At some point, I realized something simple but powerful. Your city was no longer just a location on a map for me. It had become a symbol, a place connected to a person who had quietly become important in my life. And that realization started changing the way I looked at things. I began to imagine what it would feel like to be closer, not in some grand or dramatic sense, uh, just closer in the everyday way. Close enough that the distance between us was no longer defined by long drives or complicated plans. Close enough that the city lights you see every evening would also be part of my evening sky. Close enough that the same rainstorm that passes over your street might pass over mine an hour later. Close enough that your world and my world would share the same horizon. That idea stayed with me for a long time before it turned into action. Because moving closer to someone is not a small decision. It changes things. It shifts the structure of your life. It asks questions you are not always ready to answer. Are you sure about this? Are you reading the situation correctly? Are you chasing something real or just a beautiful idea? I asked myself those questions many times. I tried to approach the situation like a rational person. I told myself that feelings are unpredictable and that life should be guided by practicality. But every time I tried to dismiss the idea, it returned, not aggressively, not urgently, just patiently. And patience is powerful. When an idea waits long enough, it slowly becomes part of who you are. Eventually, the thought of living near your city stopped feeling strange. It started feeling natural, like a path that had been quietly forming beneath my feet without me noticing. I began exploring neighborhoods. At first, it felt almost like a secret project, something personal that I didn't talk about much. I walked through streets I had never seen before. I noticed the way the afternoon sunlight touched certain buildings. I listened to the sounds of people living their ordinary lives, children playing, doors opening and closing, cars passing slowly through intersections. And as I moved through those places, I realized something surprising. Your city felt welcoming, not in a loud or overwhelming way, just in the subtle way a place can feel when you imagine building a life there. I found myself picturing simple things: morning coffee near a window, walking through familiar streets at sunset, watching the rhythm of the city change from day to night, small, ordinary moments that slowly shape a life. And somewhere in the background of all those imagined moments, there was always you, not necessarily standing next to me in every picture, not necessarily part of every scene, but present, like a quiet influence shaping the direction of my choices. Eventually, the search turned into a real opportunity. A house appeared. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just a place with good light, quiet surroundings, and the kind of calm atmosphere that makes you pause for a moment when you walk inside. I remember standing in the empty living room for the first time. There was no furniture, music, no decorations, just sunlight moving slowly across the floor. And in that moment, something inside me felt settled, not because the house was perfect, but because the decision felt honest. Buying a home is usually described as a practical milestone. People talk about investment value, property markets, future returns, all important things. But standing there in that quiet room, none of those things were the center of my thoughts. The center of my thoughts was a simple truth. This place is closer to her world, closer to the streets she walks, closer to the air she breathes every day, music, closer to the life she lives without even realizing how much space she occupies in someone else's heart. So I bought the house. The process was almost anticlimactic. Papers signed, keys exchanged, congratulations offered in polite professional voices. But inside me, the meaning of that moment was very different. It felt like turning a page in a story that had been quietly unfolding for a long time. When people heard about the purchase, their reactions were predictable. They asked practical questions. Why that city? Why that neighborhood? Why now? I answered with practical explanations because that is the language people expect. Work opportunities, lifestyle changes, personal preferences, all of those things are true in their own way. But none of them are the real reason. The real reason is more human than that. It has to do with the strange way people enter our lives and begin to matter without asking for permission. It has to do with the quiet gravity certain individuals carry in our emotional universe. It has to do with the way a single person can transform an entire city into a meaningful destination. You probably never asked for that influence. You never stood in front of me and said, "Come closer." But sometimes the heart hears invitations that were never spoken, and sometimes it answers them. That is why I bought this home near your city. Not because I expect anything in return, not because I am trying to force fate into a particular shape, but because being closer to something meaningful feels better than standing far away pretending it doesn't matter. Life is too short for that kind of distance. Too short to ignore the quiet truths that appear in our hearts, too short to pretend that geography is always more important than connection. So now, somewhere in the same city skyline you see every day, there's a small house with lights that turn on in the evening, a place where someone sits sometimes thinking about the strange paths life takes, thinking about how a single person can unknowingly reshape the map of someone else's world, thinking about how decisions that look ordinary from the outside can carry deep, quiet meaning on the inside. And every time I unlock the door and step inside that house, I remember the real reason it exists in my life. Not as an investment, not as an investment, not as a symbol of success, but as a quiet expression of closeness, a quiet reminder that sometimes the heart chooses directions the mind cannot fully explain. Distance is a strange thing. We often believe it is simple to understand. We look at a map, we measure the kilometers, we calculate the hours it would take to travel from one place to another, and we assume we have understood everything about the space between two people. But the truth is that distance is rarely about numbers. It is rarely about roads or highways or flights that connect one city to another. The real distance between two people lives somewhere deeper, somewhere invisible, somewhere inside the quiet spaces of the human heart. I used to think distance worked the way maps describe it. I believed that if two people lived far apart, they were simply far apart. It sounded logical. It sounded practical. But life has a strange way of proving that logic is not always the full story. because sometimes someone enters your life in a quiet, almost unnoticeable way, and suddenly the miles between you begin to feel different. They are still there, of course. The roads still stretch across cities and fields and highways. The kilometers do not disappear, but the meaning of those kilometers changes. When someone becomes important to you, the mind begins to behave differently. You wake up in the morning, and before the day even begins, the thought of them appears quietly in the background of your mind. It is not dramatic. It does not interrupt your life. It simply exists there, like a soft echo that follows you throughout the day. And without realizing it, you begin to measure your time not only by your own experiences, but also by the imagined rhythm of their life somewhere else. You wonder if they are waking up at the same time. You imagine what the sky looks like in their city when the sun rises. You picture the streets they might walk through, the places they might visit, the ordinary moments that fill their day. These thoughts do not demand your attention, yet they return again and again, like gentle waves reaching the shore. At first, you might dismiss it as coincidence. You tell yourself that it is normal to think about people sometimes, but the human heart has its own quiet language, and it repeats certain messages until we finally listen. The more you think about that person, the more you realize something important. They have become part of the landscape of your mind. This is where distance begins to lose its power. Because once someone occupies a space inside your thoughts, physical separation becomes less meaningful. They might live in another city, another region, maybe even another country, but somehow their presence feels closer than many people who stand beside you every day. It is an unusual feeling, almost mysterious in its simplicity. You cannot point to a specific moment when it started. You cannot explain exactly how it grew. You only know that it exists, and once it exists, it begins to influence small decisions in ways you never expected. You might hear the name of their city during a conversation and suddenly feel curious about it. You might look it up online, exploring photographs of its streets and buildings, wondering what it feels like to stand there in person. You might imagine the weather, the sounds of the evening, the rhythm of daily life unfolding in a place that once meant nothing to you. It is fascinating how quickly a location can change its meaning. A city that once appeared as just another name on a map suddenly becomes a place filled with emotional gravity, not because of its architecture or its famous landmarks, but because someone you care about calls that place home. And slowly, without making any grand announcements, your mind begins to treat that city differently. It becomes more than a destination, it becomes a point of connection. I remember the moment when I first realized this was happening to me. I was sitting quietly one evening thinking about the day that had just passed. It had been an ordinary day, full of routine tasks and small conversations, the kind of day that usually disappears quickly from memory. But when I looked back on it, I noticed something interesting. You had appeared in my thoughts many times throughout the day, not in an overwhelming way, just in brief, quiet moments. A sentence you once said, a memory of a conversation, a curiosity about what you might be doing at that exact moment. And as I noticed those thoughts repeating themselves, I asked myself a simple question: why? Why does one person appear in your mind more often than others? Why does their presence feel so natural even when they are physically far away? The answer, I realized, had nothing to do with distance, because the heart does not measure closeness using geography. It measures closeness using meaning. The more meaning someone carries in your life, the closer they feel, regardless of how far away they live. This realization changed the way I thought about distance entirely. Yeah, I began to understand that the real barrier between people is not measured in kilometers. The real barrier is emotional disconnection. Two people can live in the same building and still feel worlds apart if their hearts are closed to each other. At the same time, two people can live in different cities and still feel deeply connected if their thoughts and feelings travel freely between them. Turns into music. Connection is not limited by roads or borders. It moves through memory, through imagination, through the quiet emotional threads that link one human being to another. Once I understood that, something inside me shifted. Instead of focusing on the miles that separated us, I began to focus on the presence you had already created in my daily life. Heck, Oz, the truth was undeniable. You were already part of my world, not through physical proximity, but through the quiet influence you carried in my thoughts. This kind of influence is powerful because it is gentle. It does not demand attention. It simply grows slowly, like a seed planted in quiet soil. And before you realize it, it has taken root. There is something beautiful about that kind of connection. It does not rely on constant conversation or dramatic declarations. It exists in the small, quiet moments that fill the spaces between words. You might be walking somewhere and suddenly remember something they once told you. You might hear a song and think about how they would react to it. You might see a sunset and wonder if the same colors are visible from their city at that exact moment. These are small things, but they carry a kind of emotional warmth that distance cannot erase. And the more these moments accumulate, the more you realize that the idea of far away has become almost meaningless. Because how can someone truly be far away if they are part of your daily thoughts? How can distance claim power when the heart continues to cross it effortlessly every single day? This understanding did not arrive suddenly. It developed slowly like a quiet realization, forming piece by piece. But once it became clear, it changed the way I looked at everything. I stopped thinking about connection as something limited by physical presence. I stopped assuming that closeness required shared geography. Instead, I began to see closeness as something far more subtle and far more powerful. Closeness is attention. Closeness is care. Closeness is the quiet habit of remembering someone even when life is busy and complicated. And when those things exist, distance becomes little more than a technical detail. Of course, physical presence still matters. Being able to share moments in the same place carries its own kind of magic. But emotional presence often arrives first. It builds the foundation that makes physical closeness meaningful. Without that foundation, proximity can feel empty. Music, with it, even great distances can feel surprisingly small. This is why people throughout history have written letters across oceans, waited patiently through long separations, and held on to connections that seemed impossible from the outside. Because the human heart understands something that maps cannot show. It understands that connection is not about where someone stands, it is about where they live in your thoughts. And once someone lives there, they become part of your internal world. They influence the way you see things, they shape the way you imagine the future. They appear quietly in the background of your decisions. Sometimes they even change the direction of your life in ways you never expected. Not because they demanded it, not because they asked for it, but T, because caring about someone naturally reshapes the path you walk. This is the quiet power of human connection. It does not shout, it does not force, it simply exists, steady and patient, guiding your thoughts in gentle directions. And one day, you wake up and realize something remarkable. The person who once lived far away on a map now feels incredibly close in your emotional world. The miles are still there, the roads still stretch across the land, the cities remain separate. But inside your mind, the distance has already disappeared. But inside your mind, the distance has already disappeared because the heart has a way of building bridges that geography cannot destroy. And those invisible bridges are often stronger than anything we can see.